We are live. I'm going to go live on Instagram as well. Hopefully. Okay, there we go. All right. Hello, everyone. If you are tuning in live, welcome. For those of you who might not know me, my name is Jack Gorsline. I'm an investigative reporter based here in the greater Boston area in Massachusetts. I'm also the founder of Psychedelic States of America and Psychedelic Writers Guild. I'm honored today to be joined by a fantastic panel of some, but certainly not all, of New Mexico's finest grassroots psychedelic advocates. This is the premiere episode of the Psychedelic States of America Advocacy Spotlight Initiative, which, if you tuned in earlier this week, Joe Moore and I hopped on Wednesday to announce, is a mad dash attempt to interview at least one psychedelic advocate or advocacy group across all 50 states and DC and Puerto Rico before Psych Science starts in Denver this June. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Joaquin Orozco of Psychedelics New Mexico, and one of the leading voices in the grassroots space for an intro, and then we will go around the bend and have our fellow panelists introduce themselves. Again, thanks for joining us, everybody. Joaquin, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack. I appreciate the platform. I appreciate everybody coming. Like Jack said, we could easily have a dozen or 24 other advocates here on the call. My name is Joaquin Orozco. I'm a counselor. To just tell you a little bit about myself, I did 3 combat tours to Iraq, and as a medic, I got out and had some PTSD and had an almost near-death experience in October of 2017. Had a psilocybin ceremony that served as a wake-up call for me to start to provide advocacy for other veterans to receive this medicine. This led me to becoming New Mexico's ambassador for Heroic Hearts Project. I'm currently the vice president of DPNM, Psychedelics New Mexico, and we're advocating for unregulated use of psychedelic medicines, personal use for New Mexicans. I did want to read a quick statement by Amy Wong Hope. She wasn't able to make it tonight, so she just says that it was an honor to do this advocacy work during this legislative session. She provided some expert testimony, and she was thrilled to be a part of this. She has developed a lot of New Mexican specific psychedelic knowledge. She teaches a psychedelic studies course at Southwest College, and so she was able to apply this directly to the bill. So who's next? Who would like to introduce themselves?
Amazing. Just want to jump in really quickly and say shout out Amy Wong Hope. We are bummed that you weren't able to join tonight, but very excited to connect with you again soon and interview you. Also want to shout out Deborah Thorne and the great folks at Soul Trip who were instrumental in the crafting of this legislation. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But so many that I wish that I could have interviewed all in one big old panel, but it's just me. And I promise we'll be back to interview more of the phenomenal grassroots advocates in New Mexico soon. With that, Denali, keep us going.
Thanks, Jack and everyone for tuning in. My name is Denali. I am an attorney and a policy advocate here in New Mexico. Most of my advocacy has not been in the psychedelic space. I actually worked separately on a campaign, and most of my legislative experiences from that. The campaign was to end life sentencing for children. So the U.S. is the only country in the world that sentences children to die in prison. I worked on a 5-year-long campaign that was like this one, incredibly grassroots and eventually successful. But really grateful to now have been a part of this advocacy in this space, and especially excited to have people excited about what's going on here in this state. I'm born and raised in New Mexico, and as this convening shows, we're doing really awesome stuff here. So.
Thank you so much, Denali. And we will definitely come back because your origin story to the forefront of this conversation and your unique insight is one that I think other activists in other states should take heed of and pay attention to. Chris, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got here.
Hi, everybody. I'm a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, and I'm an ambassador of the Heroic Hearts Project. And I did a tour in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've got a lot of lived experience with substance abuse, post-traumatic stress, traumatic brain injury, and healing from all that with psychedelics. And it's been a long, crazy road to get to where I'm at now, and I'm excited to be sharing that, little pieces of that all with everybody. And just really happy to be here. It was interesting getting involved in the political process and learning from Denali and everybody else involved in this movement to make this happen. It's been pretty incredible.
Well, thank you for your service, sir, and glad to have you here. Also, shout out to Heroic Hearts Project, phenomenal organization. Big fan, and definitely recommend supporting everything they're up to. Jeff, round us out. What is your origin story to the grassroots psychedelic scene in New Mexico?
It's kind of a roundabout journey. I'm a clinical therapist, and I work primarily in the area of substance use disorder and mental health. I am a co-owner of a treatment facility in detox and the executive director of a nonprofit that helps people who are coming out of substance use disorder, facing homelessness. But really my grassroots kind of origin story started off working with North America's first syringe exchange program back in the 90s and doing street level syringe exchange and condom distribution back when it was heavily frowned upon. And, you could run the risk of getting arrested during those times for doing that kind of work. And it's just always been kind of in my blood. And so you fast forward a little bit and, I've been an advocate for psychedelics for well over a decade and working in this space politically. I don't know, about 5 years now. I started off with Joaquin and doing some work with New Mexico Psychedelic Science Society. And it's culminated into now what we have in front of us with the nation's first medical psilocybin bill.
Incredible. As a harm reduction enthusiast and advocate myself, thank you for the great work. And yeah, I mean, really in the trenches before it was before harm reduction was even a pseudo pop psychology term, if you will. So thank you, and great to have veterans of that that world on the team, so to speak. So Joaquin, would really love it if you could give us some background both into what SB 219, the New Mexico Medical Psilocybin Act, will create now that it's been signed into law, but also some of the history regarding psychedelics legislation and legislative bills filed historically in New Mexico. You've been doing this for a long time. It seems like you were involved in some of the cannabis legalization efforts as well. Fill us in. What's the 101?
Yeah, so I really started doing the psilocybin legislative stuff back in 2020. We had a lot of momentum. We did a whole bunch of town hall meetings. We were asking people, what they wanted, what they, decrim, legalization, defelonization, what it is they wanted. And so we did a whole bunch of coalition building. We organized a whole network of people. There was a lot of underground psychedelic groups, people, and so not a lot of visible advocate groups back then. And so we were able to persuade some of the leaders from the cannabis industry, from the movement that legalized cannabis here in New Mexico. So we were just bringing in a whole bunch of different skill sets. And a lot of us didn't have political experience, legislative experience, but and then COVID hit and it kind of killed a lot of the momentum, but it kind of picked back up in 2022 with, I joined NPSS, like Jeff had said, we were board members, and we got ready for the 2023 legislative session. We put together House Bill 393, which was like an 80-page document sponsored by Christine Trujillo, and it appropriated $150,000 for a psilocybin program. It didn't pass, it died in committee. And then the next legislative session, we submitted Senate Measure 12, which was simply a psilocybin research measure, and that did pass. And this allowed UNMH Hospital and New Mexico Department of Health to begin to write a report that they gave to lawmakers. And so this was kind of in a serious way. We began to look at a psilocybin framework here in New Mexico. And along the way, I wish Amy was here to talk about this, but he provided direct education to lawmakers. She allowed lawmakers to take her psychedelic classes at Southwestern College free of charge, because we felt like we needed lawmakers to understand not just simply how to pronounce the word psilocybin, but to have a deep understanding of this medicine, the origins, the ethics. And so we also took some feedback from the 2023 session, where lawmakers were like, we want this to be more than just an Albuquerque initiative. This needs to be statewide. So we did that. We went north, we went south. We included especially folks in Las Cruces, Chad Lozano, Shannon Love Rose of Decrim Nature, Deb Thorne, Soul Trip, Hector Lerma, Leanne Meadows, Catherine Warnock of Mariposa Counseling. And so it really started in a real serious way in October of 2023. There was a group of NPSS board members that went down to Las Cruces. We did a training with them. We energized them. We explained what the initiative was. And they linked up with Senator Jeff Steinborn to pass Senate Bill 219. And so just to kind of give some key points, SB 219, it creates a medical psilocybin program under the New Mexico Department of Health. It establishes an advisory board. So it's a 9-person board, which is going to include an indigenous person, a veteran, and I forget what the other specifics are, but legal protections for patients and providers, which is very sought after. And then it funds $2 million for research and treatment. So it allows low equity access for people that really need this medicine. And then lastly, it allows tax deductions for psilocybin-related medical use. So I'd like to hear from Denali on what her perspective, or Jeff, either one, on some of the history of that.
I do have a couple of clarifying questions for you, Joaquin. So I know, especially given that you're involved with the vice president of Decrim Psychedelics New Mexico, the decriminalization was something that was at least bounced around and talked about as for potential inclusion with SB 219, correct?
No, not in any serious way. But I'll tell you.
Not in any serious way?
Yeah. So it's been heavily debated for sure in our circles. And like I said, I founded a Decrim group back in 2020. And so that's been the struggle, is like, are we for legalization? Are we for not? And so we got advisement from our mentors, people that we psychedelic researchers, politicians. We weighed in, and we made a conscious decision to separate MPSS into 2 groups back in a year ago, in April of 2024. So MPSS was going to be for legalizing medical psilocybin, and DPNM, this other group, was going to be for decriminalizing psilocybin for personal use. And so that was the long-term strategy, was to hold on to that decrim part of it and to move forward. We were told this is the way to move forward, was to first, legalize the medical part, and it worked. So I can talk about decrim, but in this essence, that's what happened.
Definitely. We will come back to decrim, because I would love to hear more about what some of the pushback has been initially, what some hesitancy you may have run into with state legislators. But I do want to kick it to Denali. You have had a really interesting road to this conversation. And, by your own admission, when we first connected a couple of weeks ago, psychedelics were not really on your radar before getting involved with this campaign. I mean, you were aware, but one of the things that we talked about, both based on your experiences running some ACLU campaigns, but also the trajectory of this bill, is just how weird SB 219's trajectory is. And while unprecedented is a term that's bounced around a lot these days, it really does fit the bill for how SB 219 became law. Can you give us a little bit of background into what that juvenile life without parole campaign that you ran, and what some of that was about, how you got involved, and then how some of those skills transferred into getting involved with the psychedelics campaign in the first place?
Yeah, that's a lot. So keep me on track if I get off of it. But I'd mentioned in my introduction that, oh, my cat is about to make an appearance too. So this is Goose. She's been a big part of the work. So my policy experience is not primarily with psychedelics or even drug policy. And I started legislative work in a grassroots space similar to this one, in that it was community that wanted to see change and then needed the legislature to do that, right? And so I worked primarily with folks who had loved ones who were sentenced to life in prison or other very long sentences for crimes committed as children here in the state, and wanted to see them have an opportunity for hope and have an opportunity to come home. But that meant, navigating the legislature without any blueprint or paid lobbyists or anything, and just figuring it out on the way. And I was so grateful to then that bill was successful in 2023, and I have been able to be in the legislature since then. But it wasn't until my connection with the folks pushing SB 219 that I had again an opportunity to do the thing that I loved in this campaign, which was being able to connect lawmakers to people who were impacted by the decisions that they were making, because that is the most effective thing, right? When we were fighting to end juvenile life without parole, the most important tool was vulnerable conversations with lawmakers, right? How can we find ways to disrupt what is the normal? I mean, if we don't have money for lobbyists and the kind of resources that other people are bring to this building and this space, what we do have is our own humanity and the shared humanity that we have with others. And so inserting into that space, real connection and vulnerability about public safety, about values, about substance use disorder, in this case, about PTSD, about trauma, about healing, and the opportunity that New Mexico has to really lead, and seeing how incredibly powerful that was for just kind of like parting the way. And in, as you said, this incredibly unprecedented way, a bill, gained such tremendous momentum and so quickly. But yeah, that it was just truly a testament to the grassroots nature of this campaign. I mean, you don't change hearts and minds with high-paid lobbyists. You do the folks who are on this call, and that was really key to what happened here on the ground. So.
Yeah, amazing. Jeff, I want to cut to you as someone, Denali mentioned kind of working in the Wild West policy space wise. And, you obviously mentioned in your intro that you were very much in the Wild West in the front lines of harm reduction advocacy from a very early stage before you ever, got involved in the psychedelic space. What are some of these strategies outreach wise, both with constituents, potential voters, supporters, and legislators that you've seen, be most effective and reaching them on subjects that may seem fringe or controversial, like psychedelics or free needle exchange and condoms, in the early 90s?
Yeah, I think before the 2023 session, I can't remember what committee we went to. They were having a meeting here in Albuquerque, and we went there to talk about this. And I was actually a little shocked at the amount of kind of cliche references they were making to magic mushrooms and just kind of like the hippie dippy. And I think they actually used that term, hippie dippy. So I was a little concerned that they really didn't have, the level of education that you would want one to have when making a decision on this bill. And I think, a lot of us have really tried, our hardest to get out there and bring education to the people. I mean, there's certainly a small group of people that can cite the research and can do the the medical talk and stuff. And then there's a group of people that are just like, yeah, I've used it and it's helped. And then there's a bunch of people who kind of have a view, right? And it could be positive or it could be negative. So I think what we've tried to do really is get out there and get everybody, whether it's in the same room or touch all those populations, and parse out what they think it is versus what it really is, what they think it does, what they, what it really does, and just education. And really the best way to do that is just through active communication with advocates like Chris and people like Joaquin and people who are on NMPSS and the people down in Soul Trip. And so it was really a statewide effort to ask questions, answer questions, and just, for the constituents, but as well as meet with lawmakers and try and answer any questions or dispel any myths or untruths that they might have.
Incredible. Chris, I want to swing it to you, and building off of, effective coalition building and just legislative outreach strategies. You and I have talked a little bit about how, and obviously it's a very hot topic in the psychedelic space, how veterans are able to reach more, a diverse and admittedly more conservative political constituency than traditional, what one might consider psychedelic revolution or psychonaut advocates. But you've also mentioned, history or involvement with, substance use and substance abuse. And one of the things I'm personally most excited about with the Medical Psilocybin Act is that it includes substance abuse as a qualifying condition. That is something that was definitely advocated for. We haven't seen that anywhere else as a day one qualifying condition. It's not in Oregon, from my understanding, and it's not in Colorado, from my understanding. Talk to us a little bit about how the substance abuse and veteran angle, in terms of advocating for increased access and legal protections, how did that work in your favor, reaching more legislators, and how do you see that proliferating in other states and for other communities? What are some best practices that you'd recommend?
Yeah, I guess I'll start from the substance abuse angle. I got into drugs and alcohol very young, and I was heading down in a bad path. And that's a lot of the reason why I ended up in the Marines, because I was heading to trouble, and I probably would have ended up in prison had I not done something. And I joined the Marines 10 days before we started bombing Iraq, so I knew exactly where I was going. And that kind of speaks to how things were going in my life at that point in time, right? So it cleaned up my drug problem for the most part, but it supercharged my drinking problem being in the Marines. And, I added a little bit of PTSD and traumatic brain injury, like I talked about before, on top of all of that. And when I got out, I kind of started back down the drug pathway with various pharmaceuticals and self-medicating with other things. And, I think that was one of the strong points I was able to relay to the legislators that were worried about, this turning into another marijuana type, recreational marijuana. People are just going to be doing this all the time on a daily basis type thing. Telling them that, I'm more sober than I've been my adult life is pretty powerful, I think, and was able to impact some of their decision making. And when veterans do well on both sides of the aisle, and there are so many people that are hurting and need this. But I'm people like me and Joaquin and my counterpart who was up there lobbying with me, Crystal Romero. We're able to connect with more of them at a deeper level because we did serve, and we can make a difference for a lot of people. So I'm just super proud to have done that and to have swayed some opinions and gotten this legislation through. But there's still a lot of work to do to kind of get it implemented effectively. And I think a lot of us are still game planning how to work that angle. So
yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. Really quickly, Chris, are there any state lawmakers that you want to shout out, or that you were particularly grateful for hearing you out and maybe having swayed their opinion?
I think Senator Block had me on the Senate floor and honored me to do that. And it was cool because he's dealing with a lot of the same things that a lot of us veterans deal with. A lot of our journeys mirror each other, and we think we're isolated and we think we're alone, but just talking to Jay a little bit, or Senator Block rather, I think he was able to soften a little bit and see that there's another way forward for some of us that are really struggling. And then I think, obviously Senator Steinborn and Senator Charlie and a lot of the other voices were just awesome, but they were already kind of on board. But I talked to several senators, and I think it made a difference. So
I want to bring it out wider back to a big picture before we dig into what next steps look like and what the fight moving forward might entail. We talked a little bit about, Joaquin mentioned mentors and influences and political allies that have provided guidance to the coalition, especially in the decision to go two different routes, separating the medical and the decrim angle in terms of organizationally and advocacy wise. Has there been any direct outside involvement from political power players in the guidance and crafting of this legislation? And if so, to your knowledge, I guess this is all four of you, who are some of those groups? How have they been involved, et cetera? I know here in Massachusetts, we had the involvement of, much like in Oregon and Colorado, New Approach PAC, and a number of power players from the Psychedelic Science Funders Collaborative. I will say from personal experience, the Question 4 campaign, the public education side of campaigning that you all have noted was a great strength. It's not something that was prioritized here. So it doesn't sound like the blueprint that I witnessed, but I am curious, what, if any, outside of the state of New Mexico political involvement was there in this advocacy process?
My understanding is there was absolutely no federal. Throughout the years, we have had conversations with New Approach PAC, and then I think a few people, Compass Pathways, but in terms of this last bill, no, it's been local, statewide.
Refreshing to hear. I also want to note one of the strengths of this bill, I think, and it's been much talked about, is the naturally derived psilocybin specific language. Compass Pathways has gained notoriety for a crystal polymorph psilocybin quote trigger bill, is what it's kind of become referred to for state level therapeutic programs. To see naturally derived as a priority is really cool. So next steps, implementation, what's the rollout look like? Let's talk about it. I guess let's have this be open-ended, but I am curious, what, in your opinion, are some of the priorities for grassroots advocates in terms of next steps? I know that the Health Equity Fund that's been much discussed and much lauded doesn't actually have any funding appropriated towards it. Denali, I think it actually be good to start with you. What does that fight look like next? And how might your coalition go about securing funding for an equity fund to provide affordable access to low-income patients?
Yeah, so the equity fund is one of the ways in which New Mexico stands out. We talked a little bit too that just the process. To your question before about national partners and organizations, one of the things that made it possible for New Mexico to remain such a grassroots campaign is that this wasn't a referendum piece, and that wasn't really a choice for us here in New Mexico. We just don't have so there's like in the state you have a veto referendum, but not an initiative part. So we just don't have that as an available tool. But I think that meant, right, because we were working in the legislative process, and it's just a lot less expensive and resource intensive to do. That really kind of shielded from what it sounds like are some of the dynamics that are at play in other areas. So that's one of the ways. And right, this new because we're not in a ballot initiative, we can have more words, right? Like it's just there's more that you can say when you're not just looking at a ballot, and that means that in addition to having a lot more guidance in the in the legislation that passed, we had this opportunity to create a new approach, which was the equity fund that you started to talk about. And
yeah, so tell us a little bit about that. What does that entail?
Yeah, so the fund is created through legislation to really put words behind, what are our shared values as the community, which is that a program like this doesn't matter if it can't be accessed, right? If the people who are struggling and the people who really deserve it, that Chris put so beautifully just earlier, can't access the program. And so the equity fund, right, entails, what we see in a lot of other places is that this becomes something that, you end up having to spend a lot of money for, and it's really only treatment that's available to those who are wealthy. But what we know is that people who need to access this, right, are it's going to need to be resourced. And in the interim between it being something, that might be covered by insurance or some other method, what New Mexico has done and really leading the way here is created the opportunity for a state fund that would provide that coverage of that service. But as you said, importantly, it's not funded yet. So,
sorry, keep going.
Yeah, it's a state fund, right? And so looking ahead the horizon, there's a lot of things that need to happen, but we need to be back in the roundhouse in the state capitol, asking for the legislature to fund this program, right? To fund the state equity fund. So that's the next step, right?
Yeah. So where might those funds come from? I guess, if any of you have some insights into, are these going to be taxpayer dollars, or are we looking at, partnering with private corporations to get funding towards that equity fund, donated to the state? I know one of the other unique angles is that this, the treatment programs will be woven into the state university system, which is really great. It's not a private center carve out deal for private healthcare companies. What are some unique ways that funding might be secured for the equity fund?
So I actually think, it's creative that you've asked it that way, that, there might be private opportunities. That funding can happen already, right? There are private philanthropy and grants, right? We can and should be pursuing those. But a state fund is specifically around allocating legislative resources. And so that would be the ask for this fund. That's my understanding, at least.
Yeah. The reason I mentioned the private, the private pharmaceutical angle is I know the Texas Ibogaine initiative has, a request essentially for $50 million in funding, towards Ibogaine research at the state level. I don't think that they've secured it or partnered with a specific pharmaceutical company, but there is clear language that they're looking for a public-private partnership. So an appropriations bill would have to be filed, and some wheeling and dealing and probably some clear requests for where that funding might come from are going to have to be pitched to lawmakers directly. Then we're going to have to do this whole thing again. State committee, eventually cited a law by the governor, correct? Is that what am I categorizing, describing that correctly, Denali?
So I'm trying not to get us too into the weeds here, but I think since the fund was already created, really it's just now the funding will be what is a budget allocation, which still is a legislative process. You still have to move through committees, but it's like the budget moves as like a unified thing rather than one single bill or single issue that we have to advocate for. But it moves a little bit differently. And I know even less about budget advocacy than about drug policy advocacy.
Yeah, I am not a lawyer myself, obviously, so definitely not a budgetary allocations expert on state legislative policy, but curious in terms of Joaquin, Jeff, and Chris, what are some priorities, talking points wise, that you think might be helpful in advocating for proper funding for that equity fund? How can your coalition make affordability a key issue in terms of what comes next for advocacy?
I would say that our state has never been more flush with money right now. So we have funding there. And in the past, I'll give an example of a local county detox that opened up that was free to Bernalillo County, the most populated county in the state. Is they created I think it was a 1/8 of 1% or something liquor excise tax that actually went into a fund to help fund the opportunity for anybody seeking detox services can walk right into this facility, ask for help, and they get it right then and there. So I think we've got one, a state flush with money. Two, there's always pulling money from cannabis because it's generated a lot of money. Three, you could obviously set an aside. You could have a coalition of junior grow money put aside. I mean, I think there's several options, or you could piecemeal all of those, which seems to be popular amongst our legislators. But I don't think it's a matter of if we have the money. I just think, where do we want to get it from, and how do we want to put it in this special pot for future use?
Exciting to hear. I know that Arkansas has also had some interesting success allocating medical cannabis industry tax revenue towards free school lunches. So it's great to see that New Mexico is looking to utilize that revenue in similar ways. Especially right now, entering global recession. I think it's worth noting that even before COVID, I think the number was that like roughly 60% of Americans can't really afford $1,000 emergency. I know I can't. So to think that this is a priority is encouraging to hear. Chris, how do you think substance abuse advocacy in this space can expand, beyond the veterans community? And one of the things I'm actually, I guess, reframing my question on the fly here, this is a psilocybin-only bill, but we know that there are other really effective psychedelics, or at least there's promising research that indicates that other psychedelics might be as effective, if not more so, for some of the qualifying conditions outlined, in this bill. Do any of you see an expansion beyond psilocybin to other psychedelic, substances being offered in this treatment program in the near future? And if so, what might that timeline look like if you had conversations with legislators? Take it from there.
I have not personally had any conversations with legislators about that. I think, there's a lot of work to be done, like I said, to implement SB 219 the best we can. I think the advocacy is easy, right? Like our streets are getting ravaged by substance abuse right now. We have a high number of veterans in New Mexico, and there's a high suicide rate amongst, veterans. So getting that medicine to the people that need it, I think, is a huge advocacy angle. And then continuing to advocate for other medicines. As far as I'm concerned, this is just the start of all this. So we just have to keep pushing for the things we need to heal ourselves and to heal our communities.
Amazing. Joaquin, to your knowledge, has Decrim, Psychedelics New Mexico, or any other grassroots groups, have they talked at all, either in the past or in terms of what might come in the future regarding psychedelics legislation, and regarding other psychedelics other than psilocybin?
No, this is still pretty fresh. I mean, the bill just passed April 7th. And to be honest, I think a lot of us are still kind of recovering from that energy. But no, we are in tentative discussions with different groups. And I don't feel comfortable, publicly stating, what's going on with that. But I did want to go back to, just give more context about New Mexico.
Sure.
Like Chris was saying, substance abuse is one of the state's leading causes of death. Veterans make up a higher percentage here in New Mexico. And there's just a lot of historical trauma in the state, a lot of poverty, a lot of unemployment. And so all of these, kind of create an urgent need, for new treatments. And so, there's other sources of social equity funds that are available separate from Senate Bill 219. There's, so I don't know, Hanifa Washington. She just relocated to Santa Fe to create the Psychedelic Health Equity Initiative. She's part of that initiative working with UNMH Hospital and Bernalillo County. So they're going to start in January to offer psilocybin treatments to marginalized folks. And then also Dr. Larry Lehman at UNMH offers psilocybin and MDMA treatments for people, the folks that need it. So it's coming in different fronts for sure in the next year to New Mexico. And we really start to have to prepare and how we start to integrate this into the New Mexico medical care system.
Amazing. Yeah, no, I would imagine it's pretty fresh, and I would love to pivot to Denali here and kind of circle back even further about 219's pathway. We talked a little bit about how prohibitionists in the space kind of didn't even take this thing seriously because of the weird time frame and how quickly it was introduced. A bill like this doesn't pass in the first introduction 9.9 times out of 10, correct?
I would agree. And if you look back at when we were talking about the historical context of where we are now, if you would have looked back at the NMPSS meeting with those first group of lawmakers, it was, I think it was 2022, late 2022. If you would have had to take a poll right then and there asking like, what are our chances? We'd have been, hell no, nothing's going to pass. But because of the education push and the community meetings and reaching out to lawmakers, when it came to 2023, it was, they said it died in committee, but the first group of lawmakers that saw it, it passed on a bipartisan, rocket sled, 9-0. And everybody said that was the quickest thing that ever seen passed in a bipartisan measure. So it went from like totally uncertainty about what it is that we're talking about, and we don't know much about it, to, hey, we're all on board. So I think that momentum really carried us into this space where we're at now. And so, I mean, here we sit, right, with the quality problems that we've been praying to have.
Incredible. Denali, care to expand at all on from your vantage point, just how, unprecedented, again, to use an overused term, but the 219's pathway to law was and has been?
Yeah, well, yeah, it's exactly that. I mean, it's not only that the bill, right, this kind of thing that we expect for legislation that's complicated and involves, in this case, drug policy, right, and public safety, right, in this political moment, but especially coming on the heels of recreational cannabis here in the state of New Mexico, which I think from the legislature's perspective continues to be pretty fraught. To have this bill just slide through so incredibly smoothly was really pretty miraculous to watch. And I think it's a credit to all of the things that Jeff just mentioned. In addition to, and I think it's not addition to, I mean, this is really how we got here. It was the education and conversations that led the way to like what was really remarkable bipartisan support on the issue. I mean, and not just like bipartisan in name. I mean, you had some of the most conservative members of the Republican Party in New Mexico allied with some of the most progressives in the party, knowing how limited those terms really are to describe people. But that really was just tremendous and exactly the outcome of all of the work that so many have put in over the years.
Yeah, no, well said. I think it's important to note, and we'll cut to Chris because he had an interesting comment, thought in our chat. But I think it's interesting to note that like 91% of Democrats and 86% of Republicans, I think it was a Journal of Neuroscience. I'm going to find the study and I will post it, but support increased access to psychedelics for at least the mental health alternative treatments. I think that's a 2021 study, if I'm not mistaken. This is an issue that defies every political boundary and political norm that you can think of. And I really am continue to be blown away by that. And I'm so encouraged that New Mexico continues to, continues that trend on and further validates that trend. Chris, give us some thoughts on how the Department of Public Health in New Mexico might be able to better implement equity access
So I'm very new to
Equitable
how
access.
all of this works, and I'm not sure that it would even be plausible. But I think there's some room for some creative ideas, on that board with the Department of Health. We get a veteran voice on there. I believe there's an indigenous voice that is required too, as well as a mental health professional. And so I think there's some space for us to brainstorm, ways that maybe we can fund it, that anybody who gets a permit has to, provide scholarships to underserved communities, and, give the same level of access that paid customers get, or, I just think there's room for creativity in how we approach this. So
Agreed.
I hope that, we get a strong voice on that board from the veteran side of the house, and that they're working and listening with the community and trying to make it as equitable as possible, because there's opportunity to learn from Oregon and Colorado, and we just need to get around and hear those voices, and then we can take a look at what happens.
Agreed. No, I think that's, a great point. I think we've all talked about already how this is really the Wild West. So I think that bouncing as many ideas around and, seeing what sticks certainly isn't a bad strategy when you're working in uncharted territory. You mentioned, and we've obviously talked about equity, but you mentioned the indigenous community and how there'll be a representative from the indigenous community in New Mexico on that appointed board. What role, and this is again, I think for all of you, what role has the indigenous community played in this process? Has there been any pushback regarding legalization without decriminalization? Where does the indigenous community's role expand or retract from here?
I'll speak to that. So the Navajo Nation reached out back last year and asked us to specifically not mention any mescaline containing substances within, any of our pieces of legislation. And so, we want to honor that for sure. But I think it's important to understand the New Mexican context. We're a very ethnically distinct state. We're what's called a majority minority state, meaning that whites are not the most numerous racial group. I think it's 50% Hispanic, 36% white, 11% indigenous native. And so we have a lot of indigenous communities here, 23 federally recognized tribes, 19 Pueblos, the Navajo Nation, and 3 Apache tribes. And so, we're actively cultivating, those relationships right now. And there's several tribes that have come forward that they would like to be more engaged in the process. They want us to come out and provide education around psilocybin. Like Chris had mentioned, there's one person that's definitely going to be on the board that's enrolled in a tribe. We would expect that person to have blood quorum to actually be representing a tribe that's from New Mexico. And so we continue to answer, what is our New Mexican psilocybin program? How is it going to be distinct? How is it going to be New Mexican? And so, we would, it's going to be, I think, maybe indigeneity that was considered in Oregon's program, but wasn't, it fell to the wayside. There was conversations. So we have relationships with people in Oregon that served on their psilocybin boards. We have relationships with people in Colorado that are advising us and telling us to really include indigenous people early in the process rather than later.
Amazing. Jeff, any thoughts to add on how equity might be ensured, and how indigenous communities and marginalized communities across New Mexico might play a cornerstone role in that?
Yeah, and this was something I was really proud to be a part of with NMPSS when we first started this journey several years ago. That was a drum that we beat, quite literally throughout the entire process. And so, when we look at psilocybin as potential medicine, right? Like, obviously our number one concern should be safety, right? We want it to be safe. We want it to be accessible. And we don't want the people that need it the most to be priced out of the market. And I think that usually happens when it turns into a tourist industry. We saw that in the beginning of ketamine. We see it with other plant medicines just across the border. And, ibogaine, ayahuasca, everybody's becoming a shaman. Everybody's becoming, a healer or whatever. And I'm not discounting people that truly are. But I think New Mexico has a very unique opportunity here being in this space. And that is we control our destiny. The wolves will be at the door no matter what in terms of big pharma or big medicine or whatever you want to call it. But if we set the stage and we build the foundation as solid as possible with all these things in place, then we can at least get a jump start before, and eventually, things always get corrupted to a degree. We can set the stage to where it's accessible to everybody. And, ideally it'd be great to have it priced at such a low price point that it wouldn't be a significant trouble for someone to seek treatment if we couldn't get it, run through insurance. And if they couldn't, then they should get it for free. And we definitely have to make sure that the most underserved and most marginalized populations of our state, and a lot of those, quite honestly, our Indigenous brothers and sisters, have access to this, whether it be free or at such a discounted price that it's not going to cut into their way of living.
Well said. And for a clarifying question, Jeff, both as a licensed social worker and as somebody who's working in this field, what are, to clarify for us, what do the licensing and certification requirements look like? What are the, based on this bill?
Well, I think that's going to be determined by the board that's put together for this project, right? And so, again, I think every decision should be run through the filter of being as safe as possible for the people that are going to utilize the medicine, right? And the providers as well. So I think when you make safety your number one priority, then everything else kind of has a logistical way of falling in line. And that includes the equity piece too. So, if you're going to be a provider, then you have to have a way to be accountable, whether it be through insurance or whatever, right? That's just an example. So I just think if we keep safety at the very paramount of everything that we do, then everything else kind of has this logical place right below it.
Yeah, I think I'm curious to hear from each of you, like, what do you think standard requirements for certification look like? We don't have to go like an hour by hour basis, but it's been talked about how in Oregon, it's a high school graduate course, but then you can do like, I know Intertrek is a training program in 6 months, pretty expensive as well. We mentioned that Amy Wong Hope does some, facilitator training courses that she teaches at one of the New Mexico colleges. Do you all think that, college degree, professional certification course makes sense? What would you like to see be the bare minimum standards? And we'll go around or not, and, one by one. Joaquin, how would you get us started?
In terms of what Jeff said, safety for sure. But I would like to see practitioners. So really our psilocybin industry is being erected from the underground community, to be honest. These are people that have been doing this work for many years. I have a mentor that's been doing this work for 50 years. And so, we want to tap into that knowledge for sure. And so I would like to see practitioners, that have lived experience, that are safe, be able to have a streamlined approach rather than Colorado's approach. I think where you have to do 50 hours despite whatever your history is in guiding people, because I'm also familiar. My twin brother is a psilocybin facilitator in Oregon, and he tells me how many of his peers graduated from these programs and do not feel comfortable facilitating experiences. They're expected to have one experiential experience, and out of that, how are you supposed to have a wealth of knowledge and safety? I was introduced to this medicine at 8 years old. I come from an indigenous Mexican background, and so in my tradition, you do it. You guide. You participate in 100 ceremonies before you're, qualified, roughly, to lead ceremonies. Anyways, that's my thoughts.
No, thank you so much for saying that, and I'm going to be fascinated to hear how kind of that legacy market integration process works, and if it does become a priority. I know in Vermont, their cannabis industry has a pretty heavy, I guess, think it was like an amnesty program for underground growers and operators, and a large number of Vermont cannabis companies in the offset were former legacy market operators. So I think there's a really unique opportunity to make that happen. I'm hopeful, and I'm encouraged that it's a priority for you. Denali, what about you?
I don't know if I have much to say about what I hope, besides that, as Jeff mentioned, this is was left to rulemaking, right, and to the advisory board, and so much is so, not just the definition of who can provide, but how they can provide, right, our questions of dosage and our questions of best practices, and all of these things are big TBDs here for the state. And so the next 2 years is going to really look like having open and honest conversations with the community. And, it's not just the representation from the advisory board that makes decisions, but how is that advisory board, continuing to be in conversation with community to arrive at what's appropriate for us here in New Mexico.
Well said. Chris, what do you think some most effective talking points might be to advisory board members? As far as both equity and access goes, but also in terms of really, like Denali said, continuing to engage with the community. How do you guys maintain a real seat at the table with this state-appointed board that could very well drown you out? We've seen that in other states.
Yeah, I think, we have to cultivate our relationships is number one. We have to advocate collectively for this and, remind the Department of Health who they work for, and that's New Mexicans. And so we collectively advocate and we lean on them, and hopefully we get what we need to out of it. And I think that includes equity, not just for the people receiving this, but for our local growers. I wanted to not see them get swarmed in on and overwhelmed by out-of-state actors, and keeping our products clean, and equity for our facilitators. I love what you said about the amnesty program and getting some of our traditional healers a direct path to certification. I think that is brilliant, because if we set up a program that they can't afford to do, then it's going to squish them out as well, right? So how do we balance all of these needs, the needs of safety and the needs of our community and all of that? I think it's going to be so important. But I think the big thing is trying to gather as many people we can and collectively advocate to get the best deal that we can, and not let the government, run this into the ground.
Yeah, so we're coming up on almost an hour here, so I wanna be able to wrap up efficiently. Let's, I guess, start our ending phase here with a general question to you all. What is one thing that you would advise grassroots coalitions in other states to consider, or that you think they might be able to learn from the process that you all have undergone together?
Can I jump in and just, I want to make sure that I get this right. And so as we were talking about the advisory board and Department of Health and these roles and how we move forward, of course, the advisory board is advising, right? And the Department of Health is really where the rules and regs and our questions of dosage and all of those things will come in. And I think I maybe misspoke, so I wanted to make sure I corrected myself.
Fair enough. Appreciate it. With all that accuracy around here. But yeah, so Joaquin, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned from this process, and how can other state level coalitions elsewhere learn from your both triumphs and maybe missteps along the way?
We've had people from Washington State reach out to us. We've had different other states that are asking this question. Massachusetts, I know, for example, spent millions of dollars in their campaign and they were not successful. So people are trying to crack the New Mexico code. And I don't know that there is one really, but I mean, again, coalition building really. But I think also combat veterans, Heroic Hearts was strategic in allowing us, I myself, we've all experienced firsthand the healing of psychedelic medicine, and we were able to translate our personal stories into compelling testimony for legislatures. So that was, Chris, that was very persuasive with Senate Measure 12 and Senate Bill 219. Crystal Romero, she's another person that provided testimony. But I really just want to thank all our volunteers. There's hundreds of people that were really appreciative of the many long hours and just be dedicated to this, But I think I'll just add one last piece, is that I think veterans have leadership skills. They're used to mission accomplishment, so they're able to translate those skills, and then also they've had traumas that they're healing, so circumventing systems. So yeah,
well said. I think this is a good stopping point, but I do want to close with one final question for you all, which is, who else should we be hearing from, both in New Mexico and elsewhere? Who are some advocates that we haven't heard from tonight, and that I should be speaking to, and that everybody should be looking to for more information and more updates as to what comes next in New Mexico and beyond? I think a couple of names from each of you would be a huge help.
Larry Lehman. Dr. Larry
Can you tell us a
Lehman.
little? Dr. Larry Lehman, fantastic.
Yeah, he's been doing the studies of this nature for a long time, and not only as a friend, he's just kind of like a hero of mine. Very down to earth, very very science centered, evidence based, and just a really steady voice of knowledge and reason, and just a steady hand in this field in terms of research. And so I think when we talk about what we're doing here, Joaquin said at the beginning, we're all still trying to come down a little bit from what just happened, because that was a big adrenaline rush, right? And we can get caught up in oh, what's next, and I want to make sure we do it right and not do it quick. That's me personally, right? Because there's a lot at stake here. We've watched the cannabis legislation go through, and now it's a little bit of a disaster. It really is. There wasn't enough people, infrastructure to support all the nefarious stuff going on, and psilocybin is not going to have the runway that cannabis has. Let me put it that way. If something bad happens and something goes wrong, it's going to be looked at in a much more negative light. And so when you have people like Chris going to talk to Senator Block, when you have someone like Denali who's advocating, and someone like Joaquin who's been doing it a long time, this is not all just springing this on people. This is the culmination of thoughtful and meaningful work over time, keeping connections, making connections, and educating, like I said in the beginning. So, I hate to ramble, but it's really important from my perspective that we do this right and we don't do this quick. Otherwise, we're just stepping over dollars to pick up dimes, and then no one really benefits in the long run.
Well said, and couldn't agree more. Chris, who else should we be hearing from, both in the veteran community? I know you mentioned Crystal Romero, but anybody else in this space that you think advocates far and wide should hear more from?
I guess I would say the people down at Soul Trip are awesome advocates, and Matt Martins with Soul Trip, he's a great dude and a good voice to hear from. Obviously, Crystal Romero was my battle buddy throughout this process. She's amazing. And, I just encourage veterans. I know there's so many of you out there that haven't stepped up and spoke out and told your story yet. But, one of my realizations was that I'm a warrior at my heart, but my real strength lies in having these vulnerable conversations. And that's what really moves the needle. So.
Thank you, sir. We appreciate your bravery, both in battle and in your willingness to share. Denali, anyone else in this space that you think is an essential voice?
Yeah, I think it'd be great to talk with some of the legislative champions who are on the bill and maybe get an idea of how there was, from the get-go, such strong bipartisan support that was created. So certainly Senator Jeff Steinborn as a primary sponsor, and the many others who eventually added their name to the list.
Yeah, Senator Steinborn is my new one of my newest LinkedIn connections. I would love to speak with you, sir. I'd love to speak with all of the folks that have been mentioned. I will contact you, but hopefully you'll also contact me. Let's talk shop. Joaquin, who else should we be hearing from, both in the decrim space and beyond New Mexico?
Yeah, for sure. Dr. Larry Lehman, of course, Jeff Steinborn, Soul Trip folks. I mentioned Hanifa Washington. She's co-founder of Fireside Project. She's now working in Santa Fe. And so if you want to talk about social equity, she's definitely somebody important. Janice Herrera is also working in that program. And also the firefighters were key in supporting our work here. Miguel Tittman, Captain Miguel Tittman, he is the president of the Firefighters Union. So he represents over 270 firefighters and 700 members here in Albuquerque. And so he testified, provide very compelling testimonial. Paul Walton is another firefighter here in our county. So talk to the firefighters, the first responders. They're looking to extend this, to their population also.
Yeah. That is so encouraging to hear. First responders are some of the most vital support systems in our society, and also see so much on a daily basis that I really don't think that most of us, civilians, really understand, unless you watch some of the medical shows that are out there these days, 911, etc. I know my grandfather's a big fan of those in particular. But still, no, I'm so glad to hear the Firefighters Union is involved, and I think the power of unions, similar to that of veterans having really strong leadership skills, the collective organizing skills that many union members have is a really great asset to this space. I have not met Hanifa Washington. Hanifa, if you're watching or if you hear this, I'd love to speak with you. I do want to note the Psychedelic Health Equity Initiative. Folks who are tuning in and folks who might listen later. I think they've recently rebranded to the Psychedelics for Mental Health Advocacy Alliance, or Access Alliance. Still some very interesting things they've got going on. I would encourage folks to look into who's on their leadership team and some of their advisory committee. Some very familiar names, some other power structures, but nonetheless, they're taking a different approach, and it seems like one that's clearly paying off in New Mexico and giving grassroots partners a real skin in the game. So I do want to close here, but thank you all so much for joining us. This is surely only the start of what is going to be a fascinating chapter in New Mexico state history, and a fascinating new frontier for the psychedelic renaissance at large. Joaquin, Denali, Jeff, and Chris, again, thank you so much for joining. We'll talk again soon, and I look forward to seeing your successes only continue in the near future. Until then, for everybody tuning in from wherever you are in the world, I'm Jack Gorsline, founder of Psychedelic States of America, and we'll see you next time. Oh.